You know, it's Halloween. I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
The House, submitted by Samuel662. I was a college student in the early 90s in a small state college in New York. When I was a freshman is when this happened. I didn't go to school thinking that I would get involved with a fraternity, and I know a lot of people look down on them and say it's just paying for friends, but I'm not ashamed to say that I did rush and became a member of one. It was a lot of fun. To be honest, we were the one fraternity out of the three on campus that people actually liked to hang out with. We threw lots of cool parties and even sponsored parties at some of the local bars in town and invited everyone. There was no exclusivity that some other places see and experience. We all just wanted to have fun, and the more people, the merrier. It was Halloween of my sophomore year when we decided to have a party. You could dress up if you wanted to, but it wasn't required, and I was amazed at how many people really did show dressed up. I remember laughing at a lot of the costumes that were obviously thrown together that morning, and we were just all set to have a good time in the house that we lived in. We were lucky to have a basement with a door to the outside, and on the first level of the house we had a simple bar made out of plywood and 2x4s. Perfect for having a keg upstairs, and another one in the basement, so as to have maximum people, but in a way that no one was falling all over one another. Yeah, we had to run the gauntlet with the cops, but for the most part they kind of just stepped in and said, "Guys, keep it down," when it was getting too loud. Sometimes the town cops in college towns get a bad rap, but we didn't have that experience. So my frat brothers were all there, and this story involves three of my closest friends who are still my closest friends to this day outside of my best friend growing up. I'll call these guys Mike, Rich, and Todd. The party was going full bore and everyone was having a great time, even the people who hadn't dressed up. I was actually wearing an old pizzeria uniform from a job that I had in the summer. I still had the name tag, but I put a piece of tape over it and I called myself Loser. Everyone laughed about that. Around 1 a.m. everyone decided that they were going to head downtown as we were running out of beer, and they figured, why not hit the bars for the last hour before closing time? For whatever reason, a number of us, including some non-frat guys, stayed back and finished off the last one of the kegs. We were all just sitting around listening to music and talking about how much fun that was, and I should mention that with the 5 of us there were also 3 girls. I was not hooking up that night, but 2 of my buddies and one of his friends were clearly going to hook up, which was actually good for me as I did have a girlfriend back home. But enough about that, I'm not going to get myself in any more trouble. One of the guys was actually from the town the college was in. Because it was Halloween, we started telling weird stories in our drunkenness, and he started talking about this abandoned house about a 1.5 mile walk away from us on the edge of town. He said that every year somebody always disappeared around or inside the house, and we all called him a liar, saying there's no way that anyone would allow a structure like that to exist if people kept disappearing. He said it was true, and somehow we all got to talking about going out there to prove him wrong. Of course, this scary story always happened on Halloween, and even though it was 1 in the morning and Halloween was technically over, we still thought he was full of baloney and started to put our jackets on to go out there and prove him wrong. Our friends who were hooking up didn't go with us, so it was just Mike, Rich, Todd, and our friend I'll call Jerry. He was the one with the crazy story. Laughing and stumbling, we walked through the residential area of the street we were walking on until the houses ended and there was nothing else out there but fields on either side of the road. Todd had brought along a little more liquid refreshment in the form of a bottle of vodka, and we were all taking pulls of it as we walked, knowing what we were doing was so stupid, but at least we would have a funny story. Like I said, it was only about 1.5 miles away, so it didn't take forever for us to get there, and Jerry wasn't lying. There was a house at the edge of town, down a long driveway way away from the road. It was completely overgrown with dead grass and stuff growing in the middle of the dirt driveway. It looked like people still did go out there, as the areas for the tires was just gravel and dirt, but this was certainly not a hot spot. Laughing and making bets about who would go inside, we approached the building, which was a very old Victorian-style house. It was very beat up, with boards over some of the windows on the first floor, and the doors also were boarded up or had padlocks on them, all but one. Jerry kept telling the stories about him growing up out there and people going missing, and even though we were all well in the bag, we did start to get a little freaked out with his very detailed description of the stories. The one that really got me was about two brothers, who I did find out later on really were out there one night, and one of the kids did go missing. That was true. Probably the only story out of all of them there that was. But these two boys on Halloween had gone out there together, probably just trying to scare one another. One went inside and never came out. There was a huge investigation, I guess, and there was proof that one boy did go inside, but he was never found, and there was no trace of him leaving the way he came. He had gone up to the second floor where his footsteps in the dust and dirt on the floor had just stopped, and that was it. Yeah, I know, that's pretty creepy. So we got up to the house, and we were looking for a way inside to prove Jerry wrong that nothing was going to happen to us. But we couldn't find a way in until Todd noticed that a basement window had been boarded up, but someone had obviously pried it open before we got there. The plywood was actually nailed to the window frame, and it did open up pretty easily. None of us had flashlights, and none of us were prepared to do anything, but Todd, probably being the drunkest of all, decided to slip through the window before we could stop him. Of course, we heard him crash to the floor and a bunch of things falling all over the place, which made us burst into laughter before we even stuck our heads in to ask if he was okay. He said he was, and was letting his eyes get used to the dark to see if he could get up to the first floor. We listened, laughing the entire time as we heard him trying to navigate the dark basement, obviously running into shit and yelling, "House of Pain" to him. Yeah, some friends, I know, but it was really funny at the time. After a few minutes, everything went quiet, and that's when we heard him kicking at a back door. It had been boarded up, but as I mentioned, there was no lock on it. And he started to get it pretty loose, so we jumped over to help him pry the door open enough so we could get through. Mind you, the entire time we weren't paying attention to anything around us, only laughing and trying to get in. So we finally got into the house, and it didn't really have any furniture. It was dusty and cobwebby, and the creep factor was setting in. We were poking around a little bit trying to get used to the low light when Mike suddenly left the room and said he was going upstairs. Jerry said, "Hey man, that's a bad idea." But Mike was suddenly off to the races. Mike had obviously found a staircase in a front room as we heard him going up them, which is pretty stupid in an old house. I think all of us knew that it was pretty dangerous to go up a flight of stairs not knowing how short up they really were, but we all started slowly walking after him, and we heard his footsteps stop. We did hear him say out loud, "What the hell is this?" And then a very loud scream came from somewhere upstairs that was not Mike. Jerry immediately turned and ran for the door we had come in, and we all looked at each other like, "What the hell is going on?" until I yelled up to Mike, "Hey, you okay?" He said in a very frightened voice, "Guys, that wasn't me." And then the scream came again. That was it. We heard him running down the stairs right towards us, so we all turned around, ran down, and made for the back door. The scream came again as we were all trying to force our way out this back door, when I turned to see over Rich's shoulder this bright light in the front room. It wasn't like a flashlight. It was this huge bright light that was taking up the entire room where the stairs led. Todd came bursting around the corner looking white as a ghost, and we could even see it in the gloom of the room we were in. This light got brighter and brighter, and now was even illuminating this kitchen area that we were trying to escape from. We finally got outside, and some of us tripped and fell onto the wet grass. And as we looked back, the light was now shining in the entire downstairs floor. Even though the windows were boarded up around the edges and cracks, we could see the bright light coming through. We heard one more loud scream from inside, and then the light went out. That was it. We all started hauling ass down the driveway back to the street. When we got there, we made sure that we were all together, and Jerry kept saying, "See, I told you guys, something's not right in that place." Regardless of whether it was a human or something else, we all just nodded in agreement that something was very wrong. Todd looked back and said, "Guys, check this out." In one window on the second floor was a red light. The rest of the house was dark, but that window was kind of pulsing with this weird red light. It was super creepy. Then we heard another scream from inside, obviously a lot quieter from the distance we were at. And the window we were looking at suddenly shattered. We actually heard it cracking, but then the light went out, and that sent us off running down the road back to our house. We didn't stop running until we bombed inside and collapsed on our old beat-up chairs and sofa. None of us had said a word on the way back, and somewhere along the way we had lost Jerry. We all figured that he had just ran home, which turns out that's exactly where he ran, back to his place. We were all sweating and very scared of what we had just seen, and eventually the night wore us out, and we all kind of passed out in our semi-drunken stupor. But the next morning when we all saw each other, just by looking at our faces, we knew that we had seen something very strange. We decided to walk back there later that day to see if the window really had broken. And when we got there, the glass on that window was intact. There's no way we didn't see and hear it breaking the night before. But there it was, fully together. None of us knew what to make of it, and I never went back out there. But I've told this story over and over to a lot of different people. I've since moved far away from that part of the state, and I've been back for a reunion or two, and I've only driven by the place once. The last time I saw it, it was in a state of really falling apart, and all of the windows by that time were broken. I did hear that the state had actually stepped in and bought the land and the house, but that was about 10 years ago. I have no idea what it looks like today, but the only image I have in my mind is that bright white light, that weird pulsing red light, and the vision and sound of that window breaking. I have no explanation for what we saw, and some people could say it crawled out of the bottle that we had drank on the way out there. But for 5 of us to see the same thing is beyond strange. I mean, group hallucination? I doubt it. But whatever was in that house, or is still there if the house is still standing, I want no part of it. Halloween night, or any night for that matter. Hunting on Halloween, submitted by Eric the Wild. I've been an avid hunter since I was a kid. My father and uncles got me into it, and keeping out all the politics, I've enjoyed it immensely. Even when I've never come home with anything, it's always been fun to spend time with friends and family hunting. I've been blessed to have hunted for big game as well as small game, but primarily I hunt deer. In 2012, I decided to go out with some friends to our family's hunting cabin to bow hunt. It's on the edge of the Pennsylvania wilds in north-central Pennsylvania. When I say cabin, I mean a run-down, rickety old trailer that we took out there for that specific purpose. It is a piece of shit, but it's solid and runs on propane. It doesn't leak, the appliances work, and that's all we really cared about. Staying warm, being able to cook inside if it's really shitty out, and to be honest, hey, it is a lot of fun staying there. My 2 friends I'll call Bill and Charlie and I made our plans to go out on Halloween weekend. Halloween happened to be on a Saturday, and we were in our early 20s, and it just seemed like we all had time off and the thing to do. We loaded up on a Thursday night and then made an early start on Friday to get there, making sure we had all of our gear. I mean, the drive was a couple hours back to our hometown. Nothing like getting out to a place for a couple of days realizing you forgot something you really need. Of course, we brought along some adult refreshments for the evenings, but I want to stress that we aren't in the crowd of people, who do exist, that like to get really loaded on trips like this. Not only are they dangerous to themselves, they're really dangerous to everyone else out there, including the animals. It was a sunny day, and Chris and Bill and I were joking around on the way there, drinking coffee and talking about where we would set up our tree stands. Most of us had luck in certain areas and had been scoping things out for the past couple of months, but like I said, even if we didn't get anything, we were in for a couple of fun days. Or so we thought. I like to say right now that at the time we were all pretty skeptical of all the paranormal jazz. UFOs, ghosts, Bigfoot, you name it. I was 100% of the belief that none of that stuff was real. And after talking about this, what seems like a million times with my friends, both of them had my feelings too. And while we can't prove anything about what I'm about to tell you, we all agree that we've kind of changed our thinking. We got to the trailer or cabin, whatever you want to imagine it is in your mind as you hear this, and got to work on getting things set inside and making sure everything was up and running. There was no running water, no toilet. All that stuff was taken care of outside. We cleared out the fire ring and set up our chairs and decided to walk around a little bit that afternoon before getting ready to go out early the next morning. After gathering a bunch of wood for fires, we kicked back with a beer and some sandwiches, and then trekked out to our spots to see what was what. While we were bow hunting, we did have a shotgun with us as well as our handguns. We just quietly walked around and found the areas that we wanted to be in and set up shop. As it was turning dusk, we went back to the trailer for something to eat and planned to cook over the fire. And we were going to hit the sack pretty early. We had a couple of more beers and were just enjoying each other's company, talking about the hunt next day and all the other stuff that three guys away from their girlfriends talk about. Lots of laughs and a great time. We went into the trailer in the darkness, and all of us immediately fell asleep. Sometime around 1 a.m., though, Charlie woke up and out loud said, "Do you guys hear that?" This, of course, woke us both up, and Bill said, "What are you hearing? I don't hear anything." Chris said, "Shut up and listen." So we did. Way off in the distance, we heard what I can only describe as a loud howl. It wasn't like the yipping and crying of coyotes. It was just these long, drawn-out howls. Having done research after all of this, a lot of the stuff about the legend of Bigfoot gave me some insight, and I can say that it did sound a lot like the recordings other people have out on the internet. But at the time, we weren't sure what it was at all, and thought it must be some animal, probably in distress. It did stop after a couple of minutes. We all talked for a few minutes about how weird that was, but eventually went back to sleep as we were getting up in just a couple of hours. And that's what happened. We made our way out to our spots to start the day, and the morning was very quiet. As it got into the daylight hours and nothing was happening, we didn't see one deer, which was odd, as we normally would see at least something. But there was just nothing out there. And then again, that's hunting. You don't always see or get what you want. We went back to the trailer for something to eat, and then went back to our spots for a little while longer before deciding to call it a day. We figured we'd just go out back the next morning, and that was our plan. We stoked up another fire and continued to just hang out and talk, when Bill brought up the sound we had heard the night before. We kicked around a lot of ideas about what it could be, and soon it monopolized all of our conversation. It was about 8, and we were talking about getting back to the sack for the next day, when we heard the howls come again. I tried to record it on my cell phone, as did the other guys, but you could only hear the crackling of the fire. This howl was some distance away, and I'm sure that's why our little phone microphones didn't pick anything up. Charlie announced he had to go to the bathroom and walked off towards the edge of the trees where we had designated a spot for that sort of thing. It was an area with no grass, with trees right up on the edge, and we had set up a makeshift bench out of some logs. The ground around it was nothing but dirt and mud. He came rushing back and said, "Guys, come here and take a look at this." I said, "Dude, we don't need to see your dump." And Bill and I started laughing and making fun of him, but he was dead serious and said, "No, I'm not kidding. Come and look at this. There's footprints over here." We grabbed our flashlights and followed him over, and indeed, there were footprints in the mud and dirt. Big ones, and they were barefoot. They looked like human footprints, and I can't say that they were super massive in size, but they were big. We took some pictures on our phones, but those are long gone, and I wish to God I had saved them. And I know that Bill's phone got destroyed not long after this trip. I know. All the evidence in the world, but nothing to show for it. Trust me, a lot of people we've told this story to have called out bullshit when we told them we didn't have any pictures. The night was getting really odd. It was Halloween, and there was obviously someone else out there. We didn't jump to the conclusion that it was some kind of monster, but hey, monsters come in all forms, including humans, right? None of us have gone in that area without our boots. And after all, it was the area we were going to the bathroom. We stayed around the fire for a little bit longer, talking about the footprints, and Charlie started talking about Bigfoot and the howls that we had heard. I pointed out that we hadn't heard them in a while, and again, it was probably some kind of animal. Animals do make strange sounds, and not everyone can say they know every noise every animal makes. Anybody who says otherwise is full of it. We decided to call it a night again, put the fire out, and went back into the trailer. We kept talking, but eventually dropped off as we had been up super early, and we were going to be getting up early again. Around midnight, I woke up to what sounded like something walking around the trailer. I mean, that's kind of normal. Animals always check out what the humans are doing at night. And it was not unusual for deer or other critters to walk right up to the trailer. And that includes bears. But this sounded different. Animals usually shuffle around and you can hear them snorting and snuffling. This sounded like methodic footsteps circling the trailer. I listened for a minute and immediately thought of some crazy guy living out in the woods checking out the trailer. I whispered to the guys to wake up, trying to be as quiet as possible. They both were and said, "What's up?" before I shushed them and said, "Listen." The footsteps stopped, but after about 5 minutes of our silence, they picked up again. Then they stopped. We couldn't see each other's faces in the dark, but I know that all of us were thinking the same thing. There's something out there that doesn't sound like any animal we were familiar with. I was just about to grab my flashlight and phone when the back area of the trailer where the useless bathroom was started to shake. It was like some giant thing had jumped into the trailer. I mean, the entire thing rocked. Charlie gave out a yell and Bill scrambled to get his gear. And the next thing we knew, the entire trailer was rocking back and forth as if somebody outside was grabbing the roof and shaking it back and forth. All the while this was happening, the only noises that were being made were us scrambling to get our stuff. I mean, there was no sound from outside except the sound of the trailer rocking back and forth on the jacks that kept it in place. I immediately thought whatever was out there was going to knock the trailer off its footings, and I crazily thought about how big something would have to be to make a trailer this big. We snapped our flashlights on, and the shaking of the trailer continued when we heard the loudest howl we had heard in our lives. It was right outside our trailer, and we almost shit our pants. Now we were all yelling and grabbing for our handguns, scared that someone was trying to get in to get to us. And at no time did anything ever get near the door. It was just the entire trailer shaking back and forth. The violent shaking suddenly stopped, and we heard footsteps moving around again outside. We all shut up, even though we were scared out of our wits. No one said anything, and I took out my .45 and went to the door. I cracked it open a tiny bit and tried to see out into the darkness. And there was no moon, and things were dark, so I let my eyes adjust, but I didn't see anything. The guys asked me what the hell was going on, and I said, "There's nothing out here." But we could hear the footsteps on the other side of the trailer. The both of them moved over to the windows on that side and looked out, and Bill gave out a yell. All he said was, "It's right there!" I jumped over to look too, but didn't see what he was talking about, and Bill just kept yelling, "It's right there! It's right there!" Finally, Charlie said, "Holy shit, what is that?" I was still not in the know. I kept asking, "What are you guys seeing?" And then the howl came again. I jumped back so hard that I hit my back on the other side of the trailer. There was one more massive blow at the back of the trailer, but it wasn't the thing that these guys were looking at. It was something else. Then there were two howls that were so loud I thought my eardrums were going to burst. And like that, it was over. We heard footsteps moving quickly away from the trailer, and we were all now just looking at one another in the light of our flashlights. It seemed like forever before Charlie said, "Should we go out there?" Bill said, "Fuck no," and I was on the fence. We waited for another half hour and then heard the howls again, this time far off in the distance. Charlie thought it was okay for us to go outside at that point, and I agreed while Bill said, "No way." We went out with our flashlights quietly and, quite frankly, terrified. We flashed the lights around and saw the tall grass had been matted down, but that was it. There were no footprints or anything that we could see. But we weren't stupid. I mean, something very large, or rather two very large things, had been out there. We went around to the other side of the trailer and saw the same thing. The tall grass had been matted down, like deer had been walking through. But whatever we saw was no deer. Bill and Charlie swore they saw something that stood about 8 feet tall, maybe 10 or 15 feet away from the trailer. They said it was all black or dark brown, and it looked like a man standing there. It didn't really move while they were looking at it, and this was just before the trailer shook for the last time. I said, guys, we should go back inside and stay up just in case anything comes back. Charlie, now finding more courage, said he was going to start a fire and wait outside, but both Bill and I talked him out of it and said that's not a good idea. We also discussed just packing up and getting out of there, but I also wasn't so sure that was a good idea in the middle of the night. We ended up staying up the night, drinking some beers and talking, having decided that we were going to skip the morning hunt, and as soon as the sun came up, we were going to pack up quickly and head for home. As we continued to talk about what happened, I slapped my forehead and said, guys, we could have recorded all of this. We could have gotten video. And the craziness of what happened, which only took about 5 or 6 minutes, none of us thought of that. We were in survival mode. Again, something people call bullshit on our story. But all I can say to them and to anyone who doesn't believe my story, I'd like to see how you would react in the same situation. All that tough guy macho bullshit people talk about goes away real quick when you're out in the middle of the woods and no one else is around. Believe me. In the early morning light, we took a look at all the area around the trailer, and again, all we saw was the matted down grass. The trailer, thankfully, had not shaken from its footings, and I double-checked to make sure that it wasn't going to fall off for anyone else in my family who was going to be coming up there. We got all of our gear stowed quickly into my truck and just left and went into a little town not too far away where there's a little dive joint. We were just going to get some breakfast. We all agreed we weren't going to say anything about this until we talked to my dad and uncles and their dads, who all spent time out there. When we got back home, my dad was surprised to see us as we were planning on coming back on Monday. He asked us if we had gotten anything, but obviously realized that we hadn't. For a minute, we kind of looked at each other, the three of us, before Charlie asked if my dad had ever experienced anything strange out there. My dad was quiet for a minute and said, "No, not me, but what are you talking about?" We then bit the bullet and told him about what happened, and he didn't dismiss us. I thought he would say that we were just acting like a bunch of cowards, but he just sat looking at us from his chair. After we told him what had happened, he got up and called my Uncle Dave. He made me tell my uncle what happened, and my Uncle Dave told me a pretty wild story that sounded really similar to what happened to us. Except what happened to him was when he was in a tent, and it wasn't too far from where our trailer was. And this happened a few summers before our incident. He hadn't had his tent shaken or anything like that, but he said he had heard strange howls in the night and did find footprints around the camping area, and also some down in some sandy areas by a creek that ran through our land. Well, we didn't get any answers, but we did get a little bit of confirmation that something was out there. My Uncle Dave is a retired peace officer and doesn't bullshit about stuff like this. I'm pretty sure only my dad and uncle believed us after we did start talking about it to others. But at that point, I really didn't care who believed me and who didn't. Something was out there. Something tried shaking that trailer with all of its might, and it's something that I will never forget. A very scary Halloween with no ghouls or ghosts, but certainly something a lot of people would say is Bigfoot. We've all been out there since and have never heard anything or seen anything like that again. Neither have any of my friends or family. As I mentioned, I did look up a lot of stuff on the internet and saw that there have been reports of something like a Bigfoot out in that area. We're all convinced that what we went through was more than that dumb TV show on TV with the 3 people looking for Bigfoot. They never found anything, but I believe we did. Never Leave Your Friends, submitted by Alexis. My name is Alexis, and I'm a 24-year-old female. A while back on Halloween, I decided to visit my best friend at her college. It was about a 3-hour drive from where I was at school, but I hadn't seen her since the summer and thought it would be a lot of fun to visit her and her friends. Some of them I knew from past get-togethers, and they were all super nice girls. She told me that there was going to be a Halloween party where we needed to dress up in costume the first night I would get there. So I decided to skip the slut outfit, knowing that I'd be around guys and girls I didn't really know. I mean, though I did have a French maid, I think those costumes are pretty stupid. I mean, how about showing a little dignity, ladies? That includes me. Anyway, I drove there as my classes were all finished before noon. I got to her house that was basically split into 3 separate sections with 4 girls living in each section. Then it was a really nice day out. Everyone was out on the front porch pre-gaming for the costume party that night. Immediately, they all yelled when I pulled up, and one girl who I will refer to as T grabbed me and shoved a beer in my hand. I just laughed and went up under the porch to say hi to everyone and enjoy an afternoon beer, which of course turned into numerous afternoon beers. I had decided to go as a priest as a joke. I was attending a Jesuit college, and everyone was making fun of me about my Christian faith. I mean, all in good fun, no one was serious. We all started talking about our costumes for the night, and a couple of the girls were wearing the slutty outfits I'd already made fun of. I'll call them D and E. My friend I'll refer to as Z. I know that might get confusing, but I don't want to embarrass them should they ever hear this. And if they do hear this, they know exactly who they were and what role they played in that night. All the girls' phones were blowing up all afternoon with texts about this party, which was being held at a building in town that someone had rented out. Basically, it was just the empty basement of this large building. Hey, we were college kids and didn't really care. As long as there were multiple kegs and music, we were all set. As the afternoon turned into evening, we all ordered Chinese food and sobered up a little bit before getting dressed in our costumes and getting dolled up. I know I keep looking down on the slut costumes, but I did have my share of makeup and the girly stuff. I mean, who knows, I thought at the time, maybe I would hook up. We got to the party after taking a couple of Ubers, and I thought about driving, but knew that I'd already had a few in me and would likely have more than a few more. I didn't want a chance driving drunk, especially in a town that I was not super familiar with. It did come up, but Z said, no way, she's my guest, it's a bad idea. Looking back, I wish I had stayed sober, and I wish I had driven. We got to the party, and we were not the first ones there, but certainly not capping off the room. It was a lot of fun with guys and girls dancing, standing around talking, smoking cigarettes, drinking copious amounts of cheap beer and Solo cups. I was getting hit on by 2 different guys, and was getting even more saucy, but not to the point where I was about to make any really stupid decisions. I did kiss one of the guys who was dressed like Indiana Jones, and he kept saying that he never knew Indiana Jones was gay, but then said maybe a priest must have taken advantage of him as a young boy. We laughed, and I did get his number. Not like I was planning on seeing him right away, but he was really cool, and we were enjoying ourselves. We had kind of drifted away from everyone when we were having our quick makeout session, and he did ask if I wanted to get together the next day for breakfast or coffee. E and D at this point were completely shit-faced. They were laughing and falling all over the place, and there were a lot of guys trying to help them, and a lot of guys trying to take advantage of them. T was trying to keep an eye on them, and so was Z, but anyone who has been to a really raging college party knows how hard that is. A little after 1 in the morning, I started to feel sick. Mainly because I stopped drinking beer and had hard cider. Yeah, I know, rookie move. Mixing beer and cider together just doesn't work. So I was feeling miserable, and Z said that if I wasn't going to make a turn for the better, we should just leave. Eventually, I just found a bathroom, which I was surprised how clean it was, and I rode the porcelain princess, evacuating my stomach of the now sour beer and cider. I did feel a little bit better, but my head was banging, and I texted Z to let her know I thought it would be a good idea to go home. I felt bad about ruining her night, but she texted me and said, okay, meet me over at one of the areas where a keg was. I went over to the keg, and she wasn't there, but E and D were. They were both hitting on 2 guys, and I could tell they were going to hook up. So I texted Z again, but got no answer. After a few more times of texting and trying to call her, E and D said they were leaving, and I could just get an Uber with them. We had to get the XL or whatever size it was to take all of us. But when the vehicle got there, I texted Z one last time to tell her I was going home and I would be there when she got there. I ended up having to sit on the front seat next to the driver. This is where things started to go wrong. I didn't realize that E and D were planning on going home with these guys and that I would take the Uber back to their house by myself. That became apparent after the vehicle started moving. They were both so hammered and kept yelling and singing, and the guys were just going along with it, knowing that they were probably going to get laid. Again, I mentioned that I was not familiar with this town, but figured Uber was safe and I would just get back to the house and crash. The four of them got out and didn't even bother to say goodbye to me. I was still feeling kind of sick, but not worried about getting home. But I did text Z to let her know what was going on. The Uber driver was a middle-aged guy with a really bad mustache. He started to drive, and of course, as I said, I had no idea where I was and figured he knew what to do. I was making small talk with him and never noticed that he canceled the ride after he dropped off E and D and those two guys. But he kept driving around for what seemed like a very long time, and I started to notice that it took a lot longer than it took for us to get to the party. I asked him if he knew where he was going, and he kind of just said a quiet yes. It was a strange way that he said yes, and he didn't look at me, and then kind of stopped talking to me when I prompted him with simple questions about the town and the college. He took an on-ramp onto the highway, and I knew at this point this was not the way he was supposed to be going. I asked him where we were going, and he said it was a shortcut. Yeah, right, asshole. I've been in the car for 25 minutes, which was about 15 minutes longer than it took for us to get to the party. I said that, and I started texting Z and tried calling her, but she wasn't answering her phone. When I did call her, it went straight to voicemail, and I was getting very nervous and very scared at this point. The driver said to relax and reached over and put his hand on my thigh and gave it a squeeze. I removed his hand with mine and told him to just get me home and that if he didn't, I was calling the cops. He just smiled that weird smile and kept driving until I did take out my phone again and started dialing 911. He tried to grab the phone, or rather knocked it out of my hands and sped up, so I kind of fell back into the seat. Just as the dispatcher was answering my call, the phone fell out of my hands onto the floor. I started yelling that I was being kidnapped by an Uber driver, and the guy immediately turned on the radio and cranked the volume. I was screaming over the music as best I could to the dispatcher, but I couldn't hear anything she was saying, and every time I tried to reach down to get to my phone, this guy would swerve back and forth from lane to lane, preventing me from grabbing my phone. This seemed to go on forever, but was like 5 minutes, I'm sure. He got off the highway and drove down these streets where there were a few houses, and then turned onto a street marked Dead End. I was frantically trying to grab my phone, still screaming for the dispatcher, who I hoped was still on the line, and hadn't hung up. I mean, it was Halloween, and I'd heard sometimes they do hang up when they think there's a prank being played. The guy drove all the way to the end of this dead-end street. Then he put the SUV in park and turned to me. I immediately grabbed the door handle and tried to open it, but the door was locked. He moved towards me with that strange smile, and I was reaching into my clutch to grab my pepper spray. When I pulled it out and held it up to his face, he just out loud said, "Okay, okay, okay." He unlocked the door and tried to push me out, and I basically fell out, but immediately grabbed my phone, which I happened to find. As I hit the pavement, he threw it in reverse and got out of there, leaving me out in the middle of nowhere in the dark, not knowing where I was, and totally scared out of my mind. 911 had hung up on me, but they tried to call me back a number of times. I noticed I was also running out of juice on my phone, and the cell signal was weak, but I punched 911 again, and as soon as the operator answered, I told them that I'd been kidnapped and was now dumped out in an area, and that I had no idea where I was. After a lot of back and forth, the woman told me to stay put and they would track the GPS on my phone, but to also look around to see if I could identify anything. I didn't listen to her about staying put, started to walk back towards the main road we had turned off. And that's when I saw the SUV coming back at me. The guy rolled down his window and said it was all a mistake and that he would take me home. He thought I wanted to hook up with him. Yeah, okay, buddy. I never said anything like that to him. I screamed at him to fuck off and let him know I was on the phone with the police. His weird smile went away, and he did a very hasty three-point turn and sped off again. I sat there waiting for a few minutes after he left while I was talking to the operator, and then began walking again. I got back to the main road and saw a street sign with some numbers on it, and I told her where I was, and she said to not move anymore and that someone was on their way to help me. So a police car came to get me, and the guy asked me a ton of questions, and I gave him the address of my friends. He asked me why I was out by myself, and I told him that I'd been ditched by my so-called friends. He shook his head and said something about stupid college girls. I didn't care. I was safe in his car, and he was going to get me to safety, even though he was being kind of a dick. I got back to the house and Z was going crazy. Her phone had gotten wet and shut off, and she had been asking everyone where I had gone and figured I had left with the other girls. When she saw me, she ran up to me, and she was crying and holding on to me as I was crying too. She kept saying how sorry she was that she let this happen. It wasn't her fault. I was the one who made a bad decision. But her two asshole friends who ditched me were the ones that I was mad at, and she quickly became mad at them too. I gave a full description of the Uber driver to the police and the address where we had been picked up, and he said they would be looking into all of the drivers they could. About 2 hours later, after I'd showered and had something to eat, there was a knock at the door, and it was the police officer and another guy. They asked me to come outside and identify the driver that they thought, based on the records, was the guy who did what he did. It was the same vehicle, but it was not the same guy. That I was sure of, and I let the police officers know. What happened was, the guy's roommate, who he didn't really know that well, had taken his vehicle out knowing he was an Uber driver. He was posing as him after he had stolen his cell phone. The guy, poor thing, had nothing to do with this, had been home ill. He was completely zonked out on NyQuil. He never knew a thing. The police tracked him down through the app and talked with Uber and then went to pick him up. He had sworn up and down he had nothing to do with anything, but they asked him to drive the vehicle over to me for identification. They all seemed to get a laugh out of all of it and said they'd follow up with me in the morning. But here's the weird thing. When they did get back to me, they said that the guy's roommate during all of this had somehow gotten back into their apartment, packed up a bunch of his stuff, and fled the scene. To this day, I have no idea if they ever caught the guy, but I don't really have contact with the guy who got scammed by his so-called friend, who was obviously trying to do something to me. The next day, when E and D got back to Z's house, there was almost a fistfight after she screamed at them about leaving me alone, and how much of a bunch of cunts they were. I wanted to go home, but Z and her other friends convinced me to stay, and for the rest of that day and weekend, E and D kept asking for my forgiveness and kept saying they were really sorry. I didn't really forgive them, but just made nothing of it to get along and enjoyed what I could enjoy for the rest of the weekend. Anyway, that's my story of how I was almost assaulted by a fake Uber driver. I still cannot get in an Uber or Lyft or any other kind of car service. I'm totally spoiled on using them ever again. What started off as a fun Halloween night turned pretty awful for me. And my only advice to everyone out there is never leave your friends alone, even if it seems like a legit situation. You never know what can happen. The Guys in the Rain, submitted by Angie B. My name is Angie, and I was 19 when this happened a few years ago. I lived in a fairly rural area of my town that I had grown up in all my life. I graduated from high school and was attending community college at the time. I was pretty prudish back then and didn't have a boyfriend, and was kind of a wallflower in high school, band geek, bookworm, that kind of person. I did have lots of friends, but I was extremely shy around boys, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I didn't really take a lot of time to make myself look attractive. I guess growing up in a really religious family, that sort of thing took a backseat to church, school, and so on. Things are a lot different now, but back then, I was just your average nerd. Halloween came up that year, and my parents were out of town. My older brother had moved out of state, and I was home by myself. I'd heard of a party happening, but wasn't invited, and just resolved myself to stay in and study. Of course, I was mixing in scary movies and pigging out on some junk food, too. Because we lived on the edge of town, the houses were few and far between. We never got trick-or-treaters, and when I went, I only went to my grandparents when I was younger. So I was just going to ride out the night by myself. Honestly, I didn't care about being alone. I'd spent so much time with my studies and music that it was just another night. That would change pretty fast. A storm was coming in, and for anyone who lives in the Midwest, they know that we can get some pretty crazy weather, even this late in the season. Thunderstorms were a norm from spring to fall, and we were about to get a doozy according to the weatherman on TV. I just hunkered down in my living room with my snacks and books, with a fire going in our fireplace. My dog and cat were with me, and they were really the first ones to make notice that something was going on that I hadn't really been paying any attention to. Around 9, I was watching Halloween, The original, not all the other remakes, which I really don't care for. The first one was the best one, and I will argue anyone on that. I got up to get something to drink from my kitchen, and my dog, a big St. Bernard named Rocky, followed me in looking for a treat. When we got there, the wind had started to pick up pretty fierce, and he stopped in the middle of the kitchen floor and started growling at the door. This wasn't unusual, as he did growl at people he didn't know, but he was a big softy once you got to know him. A very protective, very dopey dog that I love very much. At first I thought maybe he heard an animal out in the yard, and I was going to the door to let him out. But when he got there, he just sat down looking out our back door and kept growling. After a few minutes of trying to get him to go out, he looked up at me and then turned around and laid down in the middle of the floor, still looking at the door. I closed it, got myself a glass of water, and found one of his treats and tossed it to him. At first, he just pushed it around the floor with his nose, which was very strange, as he normally just gobbled up treats. I asked him what was wrong, and that's when he just grabbed it and ate it, but then still laid on the floor staring at the door. Thought this was weird, but also figured, look, it's Halloween, maybe he knows. Yeah, that's the kind of dork I am when it comes to animals. I treat them like human beings. I went back into the living room, and he slowly got up and followed me, but then sat down looking into the kitchen. Once in a while he would growl, and I would ask him if everything was okay. I wasn't getting weirded out or anything. I was watching the movie and sort of reading one of my textbooks, and that's when the storm really started to hit. The wind was super fierce, and at first I got worried that maybe we would really have something severe going on, maybe even a tornado. I was jumping the gun and projecting a little bit, but we lived out in the middle of nowhere, it was Halloween, and the movie was giving me the willies. I could hear the thunder rumbling off in the distance, and every once in a while the windows would light up with the lightning. I love thunderstorms and still do, despite having been through some really bad ones and what I'm about to tell you. I've also been through a couple of tornadoes that did touch down a few miles from my house, but never got anywhere near our property. We lived next to a farm, but we didn't have anything like that on our property. So I was kind of used to all this stuff. We did have a big shed with a storm cellar underneath it, but that was all in our backyard outside of our above-ground pool. The rain started to come down, and the thunder was getting much louder as the storm approached. Both my dog and cat started to get a little antsy, and I was paying more attention to them than the movie or my homework. It wasn't a scaredy cat, but it was creepy at this point, being home alone, having them acting the way they were, and the storm all in one big mix. A few minutes after I noticed how they were acting, there was a loud thump on the side of the house, which I immediately thought was a large branch falling from a tree and just smacking against the siding. But after a second, I realized that there were no trees on that side of the house, and it was where our dining room was. It was mostly windows. If anything big had hit that side of the house, it would have broken glass with as loud as the thump was. I just sat on the couch looking into the dining room area, and Rocky got up and started growling as he was looking into that room. There was nothing in there but our dining room stuff, but his low growl kept up until I told him to knock it off, and he was scaring me. He turned and looked at me, but then went right back to staring into the dark dining room. There was a loud crack of thunder, and the thump came again right after the lightning had filled the sky. I got up and went into the dining room and flicked on the light, and then realized that I couldn't see anything outside with the lights on inside. So I shut them off and went over to the large wall of windows. I looked outside and didn't see anything. When I turned around and started to go back into the living room, the thump came again, and this time it made me jump. I gave out a little yell, and both my dog and cat jumped up. Ditzy the cat was on the couch looking at me, and Rocky started barking. I tried to shush him and told him that it was just a bad storm, more trying to calm myself down than him. After about 10 minutes, the thunderstorm was really raging, and the rain sounded like sand hitting the windows of my house. That's when I heard clumping on my front porch and the doorbell ring. Of course, that startled the three of us, and Rocky set off to barking again. I heard a muffled voice outside saying, "Help, please help," and I went to the door and turned the porch light on. There was a man in a long raincoat standing on my porch with a very strange face. He was ghostly white, and the rain had smashed his hair down on his head, and he looked like a very large drowning rat. I opened the door a little bit with the chain on it and asked through that and the storm door what was going on. When he saw me, his face lit up, and he said that he was having car trouble and wanted to use our phone to call for help if he could. I mean, this struck me as really odd. This was only 3 years ago, and who doesn't have a cell phone in this day and age? But I will say that cell coverage out at our house was pretty spotty at best. I mean, we still had a landline, but it was odd that this was happening. Of course, immediately I remembered all the scary stories and movies that I had seen or heard, and got very nervous. Before I could even say anything, the man started to try to open my storm door. Thinking as fast as I could, I told him that our phone had been knocked out by the storm and that cell service in the area was not good. Again, and his eyes lit up and he said, "Yeah, I know, I've been trying to use my cell." For some reason, I knew that this was not the truth. There was just something about this guy that I didn't trust. And then the thumping on the side of my house came back into my head. I immediately assumed he was the one hitting my house for whatever reason. I asked him where his car was, and he said it was about a mile down the road and that he had pulled it onto the shoulder. He again tried to open our storm door, which was locked, and I said, "I'm not really sure I can help you, but if you go back to your car and wait, I'll immediately call the police when our phone comes back on." This was stupid for a number of reasons now that I look back at it. I had basically just told a stranger who was trying to get into my house that I had no way of communicating with the outside world. Lesson number 1, don't ever do that wherever you live. My answer to him didn't make him very happy, and he said in a very gruff voice, "Look, it's cold and wet out here. Can I at least stay inside until the storm blows over?" I didn't say anything right away, and he became very impatient and tried to open the door again. I told him at that point I couldn't help him, but I would do my best and that he should get back to his car and out of the rain. For a minute he just stood there staring at me, and then broke into a huge grin and said, "Yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll wait at my car. I hope the phone starts working soon." He then gave off this really odd laugh and flashed this grin even bigger. As I was shutting the door, he stood there looking at me. I locked it and then backed up slowly, and bumped into Rocky, who was staring at the door with his low growl. That's when I heard a thump coming from the back of my house, and I thought about the back door that I had just had open not too long ago for Rocky to go outside. I looked out the front window and saw the man turn slowly and start to walk down our driveway. But he stopped, turned, and looked back at me in the window as he pulled his raincoat around him, and the rain kept coming down, and the thunder and lightning kept doing its creepy magic. At this point, I was now pretty nervous, just based on the way that the guy looked and the strange thumping that was coming from outside my house. He turned and continued walking, and I immediately went to my phone, the landline, that is. Just my luck, it actually was dead. Perfect, I thought. I jinxed myself, and now I really don't have a way to contact anyone. For shits and giggles, I did try my cell, but my bars were teetering between 0 and 1, and I knew that I could be in trouble. Rocky was still pacing and growling. I went over to the kitchen and looked at the back door and realized that it was closed, but I could see that it wasn't locked. A very large thump came from right to the side of the door, and I had to make a decision. For a second, I thought about hiding in my basement, but then I thought I need to lock that door first. I ran to it and flipped the deadbolt just as a very bright flash of lightning lit up my backyard. I screamed when I saw 2 men standing not far from our patio. They were completely naked. They both had extremely long hair that was blowing in the wind and rain that made them look even creepier. When I screamed out, Rocky lost his shit. One of the men started to walk towards the door, and I was hoping they didn't see me standing in the kitchen. I backed up and went into the living room, thinking that Rocky would scare them away. But that's when I heard steps on the porch again, and someone trying to open the storm door. It was kind of a banging and pulling at the same time. Rocky kept barking and was running from the front of the house to the back. And I didn't know what to do. I just picked up the phone again, but it was still dead. That's when I realized I had to do something else, even though I was terrified to move around my house and leave any of the exits unattended. I mean, what else was I going to do? I ran to my parents' room and got my father's shotgun from his closet, and then went into his sock drawer where I knew he kept one of his pistols. Thank God my father taught me how to shoot, but one thing I overlooked was if either of these two guns were loaded. We had lots of other firearms, but they were locked in a safe in the basement, and I wasn't ready to go down there unless I really had to. I know that sounds stupid, but for some reason I thought it would be safer upstairs if these guys tried to get in. I heard more banging at the front door and the back door and knew I was in trouble. I mean, seriously, I've got a creep on the front porch in a long raincoat and two maniacs naked in a thunderstorm at the back of my house. I put the pistol in my front jean pocket, and it was a .38 if anybody cares, and I held the shotgun in my arms and yelled to whoever was on my porch that I was armed and would be shooting anyone that came into the house, regardless of car trouble or whatever. Over the wind and rain, I heard laughing from my porch, and that just made my freak out even freakier. I was also getting angry. I turned the living room lights off, flipped the TV off, and the only thing that was illuminating downstairs now was the fire in the fireplace, which was not a roaring blaze that it once was. Once again I yelled out, "I will shoot anyone. Shoot first, ask questions later." I told you I was a dork, but that's exactly what I said. The banging had stopped, and it was just the storm making all its noise at this point. I went over to the front door and peeked out the side window, and the same guy was still standing there, now with the lights off. But however, I could see that he too was now naked. He was standing there, just in his boots. I yelled to get the hell off my porch, and that I'd called the police, and he yelled back, "Oh, I thought your phone was dead." Dead. I like that word. Then he started laughing. Okay, full freak-out mode on at this point. I ran back to the phone hoping to God that it was back on, and it was. I dialed 911, and before the person answering could even say a word, I was screaming that there were naked men around my house trying to get in. The poor guy who answered could barely get a word in edgewise as I kept yelling about the naked men trying to get in and having them banging on my doors and the side of my house. I had a shotgun. I'd be shooting anyone who came in. In retrospect, I wonder if I would even have had the guts to do that. And I will say, hopefully not ruining the end of the story, that I didn't have to. I mean, shoot directly at someone, that is. As I mentioned, I was on a landline, but it was a cordless phone, and every once in a while there was a loud blast of static as the storm was still doing its thing. And finally, I had shut up enough and listened to the 911 person ask me where I lived, and I did get the address to him. I kept saying, please don't die, meaning the phone, which only confused the person on the line even more. He kept asking who was dying and if anyone had been shot, and I kept saying, no, the phone, no, the phone. Then I heard glass break in the kitchen. I screamed out loud, even louder than before, this time yelling, "They're getting in!" And the guy told me to not hang up and that help would be there as soon as possible. Yeah, right. I remember asking him if I would be in trouble if I did shoot anyone, and he kept saying, "Don't shoot anyone." I slowly went over to the front door, and that naked guy was still there, now pounding on the storm door, and I saw that he had broken some of the glass. It kind of just sputtered, but there was blood on the glass. I screamed out again that I would be shooting, and there's the 911 operator yelling, "Don't shoot anyone, help's on the way." Rocky was still in rare form, barking at all of this, and it was hard to focus on all of the things that were happening. The guys outside, the operator on the phone, the dog barking, and me just shaking and going out of my mind. I mean, this was the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to me in my life, and honestly, it still is. Somehow I got the courage to poke my head into the kitchen and saw that one of the panes of glass on our back door had indeed been broken. The operator kept telling me that help was almost there, that he'd caught a car that was in the area, just to keep my cool and to not shoot anybody. I saw a hand come in through the broken glass that was bloody all over, all the way up to the arm. It was leaving smears of blood on the door as whoever it was looking for the deadbolt. I screamed out, "I'm going to shoot," which prompted the operator to say, "Don't shoot." But at that point, I set the phone down and cycled the shotgun the way my father had showed me. The shell came out, and I pointed the shotgun at the back door. Another flash of lightning showed one of the naked men standing right at the door reaching in. From somewhere down deep, this nerdy girl moved towards the door and poked the barrel a little bit to the side of the guy's arm. He immediately realized what it was and jumped back. Another flash of lightning, and I saw him go back to standing at the edge of the patio with the other guy. And that's when I did fire it off. They stood shocked for a second, and then ran around the side of my house. I didn't shoot at them. I shot above them, but I was worried about the spread. Maybe it did hit one of them, and I didn't think that I would be in trouble as they had tried to break in, but holy God, this night was getting crazier. There was a loud bang at the front door and a bunch of people yelling. I don't think it takes a genius to know it was all three of those guys. I heard them yelling back and forth with the thunder breaking them up, and then their voices went away. I picked the phone back up and told the operator that I had shot. And he asked because he clearly heard it through the staticky phone. He told me to hold tight. Someone would be there within a minute. I told him I didn't think I hit anybody, and they had tried to break in, and there was blood on the door and some on the floor and wall right next to the back door. Through the storm, I heard a police car siren and saw the flashing lights coming up my long driveway. I went to the front door after setting the shotgun down on our little table next to the door, and then I opened it, which later the officer told me I should not have done. I should have just waited for them. But I was so far gone at this point, I just wanted to see the face of someone who could help me, and not the face of these three naked weirdos who were trying to get into my house. One of the two officers came up onto the porch as I opened the door, and he could clearly see that I was frightened beyond any help. I ripped the chain off and screamed at him to help me and tried to get him to come inside. He said something into his shoulder radio and told me to back up from the door as he approached. I unlocked the storm door first and waved him in, a crazy-looking face just saying, "Please, help me." He opened the door and immediately asked my name and looked down at the shotgun. He then looked back at me with his flashlight, noticing the gun in my pocket, and immediately told me to place the gun on the table. I didn't realize at the time why he was asking me to do that. I just told him, "Come inside and help me." He did, took the gun from me, set it down on the table, and then tried to calm me down, but kept talking into his radio. It turns out he was talking to his partner, who was in pursuit of the three naked guys as they were running across my front yard towards the field of my farmer neighbor next door. The storm was starting to go away, but the rain was still there, and the wind was still whipping through the front door. I finally calmed down enough to tell the officer what had happened from beginning to end. Shortly thereafter, his partner came to the door. I had sat down, still holding on to the phone. The operator had hung up once he knew that help was at my house. Rocky took a liking to both of them. Out of nowhere, a protector, and now back to just being a dopey dog. After getting out the entire story, the officer called some other people, and within a half hour there were 3 other cars in my driveway as officers walked around my house looking at the damage that had been caused. They could also tell that I had fired the shotgun outside, which seemed like a distant memory to me at that point. But when all my senses came back, I realized that I really couldn't hear much. Try shooting a shotgun indoors with no hearing protection and see what happens. That's probably why I was yelling at him to help me so much, because I couldn't really hear or understand what he was saying. They all asked me a lot of questions, and where my parents were and all that kind of thing. The storm was gone now, and I immediately called my dad. They were in the city at some kind of work function, I told the police, and when my dad answered the phone, I was a mess trying to tell him what happened, and the officer said, "Give me the phone." In a long 3-way conversation, we got the story out, and my parents said that they were leaving right then and would be home soon. As I sat there waiting for my parents to come home, most of the cars left, and the officer had told my dad that they would be waiting, but they would likely be back in the morning to continue to look around. They did see all of the blood and muddy footprints on my patio and front steps and porch. It seemed like forever. But my parents got home and my mom started to cry and held on to me and kept telling me that it was going to be okay and that I was fine. Yeah, I kind of got that, Mom. The police took pictures of all the footprints in places where there was blood at the back door and asked us to not touch anything. Someone would be out to take swabs or something. I can't remember exactly what he said. But I figured he was talking about getting some kind of sample from the blood, which is what ended up happening. It was kind of like an episode of CSI or whatever. The police talked to my dad for a while and recovered the shell in my kitchen. They did another sweep around the house but didn't find anything, and it was then that I found out that his partner had chased the 3 naked guys into the fields, but then he lost them. I won't bore anybody with what happened the next day. It was more of this kind of police stuff as they looked around and checked things. But at the end of the day, those 3 guys got away. The police didn't find any abandoned car or anything like that on the roads anywhere near my house. And when they checked with my neighbors, they hadn't had any problems. No one had asked them for help, nor had they seen or heard any naked people running around. How those guys knew I was home by myself is still a mystery. How they got all the way out to my house is still a mystery. I mean, what were they doing out there? All of it was a mystery. Nothing ever came of anything, except my uncontrollable fear of being left alone, which I still deal with even though I'm away at university now and living in a dorm with a roommate. I'm especially freaked out when there are big storms. I try to be around people as much as I can, and college has really helped me come out of my shell. I'm not the nerd I once was, and my friends always tell me that I never was a nerd. I guess that's the funny upside to the story. But that was one of the craziest things that has ever happened to me on Halloween, and I don't get into it the way a lot of my friends do now. Sure, I'll go to parties, but I'm always looking out the windows into the dark. I know it's a silly feeling, but sometimes I have a sinking feeling that somehow I'm going to run into one or all of those guys again. Thanks for reading my story. Happy Halloween, I guess. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories Halloween Edition. Thanks to everyone who submitted their stories. I do have a couple more that were submitted but were not specific about Halloween, so check those out coming up soon. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on my channel, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you haven't already, please like and share and subscribe to this channel. Shoot me a comment down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And of course, follow me on social media. All of the links to that are in the description below. Everyone, have a wonderful and safe Halloween. Be careful out there. Lots of crazies, but don't believe all the hype you see in the media. Just have a good time. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.